All right, guys, welcome back to another episode of BassQuest. I think I'm live here. Today, we're going to talk about adapting to changing conditions. I'm really excited to do this video. It's something relevant to what's going on right now. You know, we've got tons of rain that's hitting the Tennessee Valley. I looked at the 10-day forecast, and it looks like the next 8 or so days we're going to get pretty much solid rain other than tomorrow. So I'm assuming we're going to have some high water. We're going to have some dirty water. We also have fish that are transitioning out of wintertime, the kind of wintertime seasonal patterns, on into pre-spawn patterns. So the fish are going to be wanting to move shallow, and combination of all these weather factors are going to, wreak some havoc on what's going on with these fish. But it's going to be pretty awesome. Let's just jump into the video here. I'm going to let a couple more people dive on. Feel free to comment below if you can't hear me or something silly like that. Alrighty. Let's see here. What is up, everybody? Flea in the house. Headed to Guntersville next week. What areas should I try? I haven't really looked at Guntersville lately, so I'm not really sure. I know there's a bunch of guys catching fish on traps down there around hydrilla, so I'd be looking to see if I can find some good hydrilla. There can't be too much of it with all the rain and current and stuff that they've had down there. I'm sure a lot of it's been killed out, so I would be looking for areas that had good grass in it. What's up, Randy? All right, let's jump into this video here. We're going to talk about the types, and as always, guys, if you look down in the description, I've got an outline of what we're going to be talking about today, so you can go through that and kind of keep up with me on there. All right. The first thing I want to talk about when we're talking about adapting to changing conditions is what are the types of changing conditions I'm talking about. Obviously, right now, we've got all this rain coming in. The changes that we're going to see is changes in current, so the levels of current that are coming down the lake are going to be fluctuating. There's going to be a lot of current as they're trying to push some of that water downstream, and then it's going to back down. And it could go up and down depending on how many fronts specifically move in. Another thing that we'll most likely see is changes in water clarity. I was actually out on the lake today, and I noticed a lot of the stuff, I was fishing south, a lot of the stuff was stained, but there was pockets of cleaner water, and there was current breaks with little mud lines on it, and that's where we actually caught a lot of our fish today. So paying attention to areas like that is going to be important. So changes in water clarity and changes in water level. As you get an influx of water, of course, the water will rise. We kind of talked about that in the last video. I don't know if a lot of you haven't seen that. Probably go over there and make sure you check that video out as well. But there's other changes that are coming up as well. So changes in barometric pressure. So when you have fronts roll in, you have variations in the barometric pressure. As the rain especially starts to come in, the barometric pressure will drop, and as that front pushes out and clears out, you usually get a lot of wind, and you also get a rise in barometric pressure. I tend to think, and there's a lot of debate on this, I tend to think the fish bite better during events where you have low barometric pressure. However, I've caught some really, really big fish when the barometric pressure is high, but it seems like to me when it's on the move, tends to be some of the best time to catch fish. So whether it's rising or dropping, tends to be a good time to catch them. Another thing is the moon phase. The moon itself affects a lot of things. It affects the spawning of both your target species, say bass or crappie, but it also affects the forage, so shad and bluegill. It affects your crawfish, whether they're going to come out and be spawning or molting. So you have to really pay attention to the moon phase as well. Another thing that I noticed with that is I look a lot at some of the almanacs, and they have some apps that you can look at the moon rise, the moon crest, and moon set. And to me, that actually has made a difference to me. It'll tell you peak feeding times or movement times for deer and other species, and it seems like that actually applies to the fish. A lot of times during those peak periods is when I'll see a bite window, and that can be especially important when you're talking about fishing wintertime, because again, you have less bites that you tend to get. Another thing is seasonal patterns. So that's another factor that we have to think about when we're talking about types of change or adapting to changing conditions. The fish do different things through different seasonal patterns. You have the winter patterns where fish are kind of pulled out. A lot of times they're a little bit deeper. You got pre-spawn where fish are wanting to push shallow. They're migrating a lot. You got the actual spawn itself when they're already set up and they're in those backwaters and they're spawning, doing the deal. And post-spawn as they begin to migrate out. And then you have summer fishing, which is a lot of times fish are out doing their thing in the summertime, and then they push back in the fall. And the whole process seems to cycle back through. So when you're talking about any of these other conditions, you have to cycle that or filter it through the lens of looking at where those fish should be in their seasonal pattern. We've already talked about weather changes, water clarity, things like that. Now, another thing that's a very important change to be looking at in a condition that you need to adapt to is changes in forage patterns. Some of the things that jump out to me is like the bluegill spawn, the shad spawn, when the crappie are up spawning. Those are the forage of the fish. They have to move to those areas, and a lot of times there'll be bite windows and feed times that you need to take advantage of when those events are happening. Another thing is, again, we talked about the crawfish. When they're spawning, when they're molting, usually has to do with the Moonphase on that. Additional forage patterns that I see a lot on Chickamauga specifically is the mayfly hatch. So you get all these mayflies that come out. Well, if you're still out ledge fishing, you're going to miss out on that bite window. A lot of those fish will push shallow into those areas, especially if you have an extended mayfly hatch. More and more fish will kind of get in on that, and you'll be wondering, you'll be left in the dark wondering where the heck all your fish went. Let's see here. I'm going to look through some of the comments. Yeah, the hats, man, they're awesome. Check out Bass Attitude Fishing. It really helps me out if you guys go and purchase anything from them. But yeah, awesome apparel. I use this stuff all the time. Let's see here. Daylight hours as well. That's a good point as well. That's one thing that I meant to write down here. I think I did, but I'm not sure if I made good use of it. But changes in light. So when you have your daylight, when you have your first sunrise and your sunset, of course those moments of low light tend to be a good time when you'll get a bite window a lot of times, especially for moving baits. I notice a lot of times too, depending on the time of year, a lot of times in the winter and sometimes even in the summer, you'll get these weird midday bite windows, and sometimes that's when you'll catch your biggest fish. All right, moving on. If anybody has any questions on these individual changes themselves, go ahead and start commenting those as well if you want to. We're going to move on here a little bit. Looking at how to deal with the changes themselves. Each one of these changes, whether they're seasonal, whether they're related to weather patterns or anything like that, each one of these changes has things that you need to be aware of, and you need to be able to adapt to those. So the first thing I'm always thinking of when I'm out on the water is being flexible. It's really hard to do, especially when you fished a lake that your entire life. It's really easy to get out there and fish history, but you have to think about it. Fish the moment. When you get out there, you have to be thinking about what's going on right now and make game time decisions, so to speak, on where you're going to go, where you're going to find these fish. So a lot of times, it's not just about going back to the same old spots that you've gone to over and over again. You can't really depend on that, especially when the conditions are changing, because, if you're fishing history, it was like, I caught him here last year. Well, last year could be different. Maybe you got there and there was, more current this time last year, or the water was higher, or any other myriad of different factors. So you really have to be paying attention. And what falls into that is, first of all, I like to cover water. Anytime I'm fishing any kind of conditions or I feel like things are changing on me a little bit, the first thing I'm thinking is I need to cover water. And that doesn't necessarily mean that I'm going to put my trolling motor on high and just start burning down the bank, just cranking a moving bait as fast as possible. Sometimes you have to learn how to fish fast but slowly. So in other words, your presentation can be slow, but you're fishing fast. In other words, your mind is thinking several steps ahead. So say, in a lot of conditions, say muddy water, for an example. If I'm going down a bank and I'm fishing really dirty water, well, I might be throwing a moving bait down that bank, right? So I'll pick up a big spinner bait, I'll pick up a crankbait, and I'll start cranking that thing through there. Maybe it's a square bill, shallow cover or something. I'm cranking down through there. Well, when I get to a laydown, I'll stop. So I'll be burning down through there. I can fish relatively quickly. I come to a laydown, or maybe it's a point with a stump on it, or a dock on a point, or some kind of structure where I think, structure and cover where I think, man, there should be some fish there. That's when I'll slow down. I'll pick up that jig, make multiple flips in there, and then I can move on to the next thing. So it's about thinking ahead. It might be where you're depending on the pattern, you might be jumping from point to point. So you can still fish that point slowly, but you're not fishing the dead water in between. That's why paying attention to all these factors can really help you. Another thing that I put on here on the outline is keep your head up. And what I mean by that is, it's not just like the positive thinking to keep your head up, but it's also, when you're talking about that, you're talking about keeping your eyes forward. In other words, you're scanning your surroundings constantly. You're not just focused on that cast and making that cast. You need to be able to make the cast, and then as you're presenting that bait, be focused on a lot of other things that are going on, especially with a moving bait, because you're not as dependent on watching your line. So I can be looking around. I'm looking for bird activity. I'm looking for maybe some bass coming up, schooling, or bait fish activity, just any kind of little thing that might clue me in. If it's summertime, looking at vegetation, maybe the vegetation is moving, and I can say, oh, there's definitely some fish in that area. So any of these little tiny nuances can key you in on what's going on. And one thing I put on here is when you see something, act on it immediately. I can't tell you how many times I've watched fish on a point. I'm sitting there fishing an area that I want to fish, right? I'm stubborn. I'm fishing this area. I look across, I see a couple fish bust on a point. I'm just looking at, I'll go fish for them later. Keep throwing over here, keep throwing over there. I burn another 30, 45 minutes. And those fish have been over there that whole time. I go over there and I start catching fish, but I could have caught a lot more if I wouldn't have been so stubborn and just gone over there and started in on that pattern. Another thing I put on here is be efficient. So we talked about that a second ago, about as far as thinking about what you're doing. You're covering water, but you need to be efficient in covering that water. So whether it's fishing moving baits in between, whether it's completely skipping certain stretches of bank in order to fish key areas, if it's offshore stuff, you're going and fishing specific spots. And that's why really paying attention to an area, idling over an area, finding the spot on the spots. In other words, the juice, so to speak. Say there's an offshore hump. Well, there might be a couple areas on that hump that have a harder bottom, a different makeup. Maybe they have a lay down on them, something that holds those fish in that key area. So if you go straight to that juice or straight to that area where those fish should be, you don't get bites. Well, it's probably not worth your time to go ahead and fish the rest of that area. Same thing with, say, another example, we're going into a creek. The fish are migrating into the creek. Well, if we don't get a bite in the first couple secondary points in the first third, well, we shouldn't fish all the other secondary points in the first third, right? We should push on to the second third of the creek, check that, then push on to the back. It's about being efficient and thinking about these things as you're fishing. And a lot of this, for me, it helps me to plan in advance. So I already have an idea of what should be going on in my mind. So when I get out there, I can begin to adapt to the situations from that point instead of just getting out on the water cold turkey and not knowing exactly what I'm planning on doing. Another point I have here is rule out what you can. It's can be very difficult to find areas that have fish or to find areas that have the right kind of fish, but it's really easy to rule out a whole bunch of water that shouldn't have fish. And that's when we go back to the seasonal patterns. Say the water gets high. Well, that doesn't mean that everywhere on the lake the fish are going to push shallow, right? They're going to push shallow where the fish already are. So if the fish are pushing into the first third of a creek, they're going to be shallow in that creek. That doesn't mean they're going to be shallow on a hump that's way out on the main lake. That's not necessarily going to work. It doesn't mean that they're going to be shallow in the last third of a creek. You have to think of it in context of where should these fish be. Are they in their stable winter pattern? So say they're out there already, well, they're going to be shallow in that area, right? If they're in a summer pattern, again, shallow in areas where you were catching them in the summer. If it's spring or fall, then they could be transitioning anywhere in between those migration routes to the spawning areas, and they're going to be shallow in those areas. So you have to filter everything through the lens of the seasonal pattern in order to make sure you're on par with what's going on, so to speak. This is another important one. I think one of the most important things that a lot of guys I see overlook is you catch a fish, and the first thing you want to do, especially if you're on some schooling fish, is you want to catch that fish, and then you're taking it off and you're throwing it back to go catch another one, right? Well, stop doing that, especially if you're in the wintertime or you're on a slow biter, you don't know exactly what's going on, say a new body of water. When you catch a fish, look at it. Look down its throat, see if it has really red crushers, really red lips. Does it look like it's been feeding on crawfish? Because a lot of times when they're like that, they've been feeding on crawfish. You can feel their stomach most of the time. If they're eating crawfish, there'll be hard spots on their stomach. If they're eating bluegill or crappie, you can feel the outline of a panfish in there most of the time. If they're eating small bait fish, you can feel the individual bait fish in their stomach. A lot of times they'll have a tail sticking out of their mouth. They might have sore spots on their sides where lamprey eels have been sucking on them. So, most of the time, if you see that, the lampreys are out, which means fish are eating some of those lampreys as well. So there's a whole lot of individual clues that you can glean just by looking at the fish. You can see, again, the color of the fish itself. Is it pale? Does it have really good color? So if it's pale, a lot of times in the wintertime or when you get to the early pre-spawn, if the water hasn't been muddy recently, well, hey, that's probably a new fish. That's a fish that's moved from deeper water into shallower water. If it's really clean looking, has a whole lot of vibrant color to it, well, that's probably a fish that's been living shallow. And the same thing, you can look on their stomachs and see mud sometimes. If they're just with their belly straight in the bottom there, they'll get like a coating of mud on their pectoral fins down there on their stomach. You can see that mud and say, oh, those fish are sitting right on the bottom. Or they might have a beat up tail a little bit. That could be one of two things. It could be related to spawning activity, and it could be fish that are sitting on the bottom in really hard bottom areas up shallow eating on crawfish. I've noticed that a lot. Guys will come out in June and July and say, hey, the fish are spawning. I found one with a bloody tail, or I caught a big fish with a bloody tail. Most of the time that means that fish was actually just up in a hard bottom area eating some crawfish. So any of these clues can get you going in the right direction faster if you're paying attention to them. All right, I'm going to go back up here. Let's see here. Any questions? I'm going to go back up here. Wendy Duncan says, does a lot of boat traffic bother the fish movement? Yes, it can vastly influence the way the fish are acting. And that's a good point as far as a changing condition. That can be a changing condition as well. So say you go out and you pattern some fish that are really good and easy to catch during the week, but you notice on the weekend those fish become more difficult to catch, or during tournament day it comes around and you can't get those fish to bite. Well, it could be a lot of different factors, but a lot of times on the weekend, especially in warmer weather, you have tons of boat traffic. So if you're in a main travel area where you got boat traffic going back and forth, or if you're on a community hole where a lot of guys are fishing, that pressure can actually get those fish acting differently. Instead of actively feeding, they're more in a survival mode, and you might have to do something different, really finessey or something reaction style to get those same fish to bite. And sometimes they won't bite at all. I've seen them push off, especially shallow areas. They'll push off and suspend and be just about impossible to catch. Let's see here. How do I fish cold, muddy water in the winter? Cold, muddy water, Samuel asked this question. That's one of the most difficult things to fish. And a lot of times it's just, you have to realize the fish are still doing the same thing. If it's really muddy, and when we're talking about muddy water, I'm assuming you're talking about less than a foot of visibility, like that chocolate milk kind of water. Those fish, they're going to move shallow and they're going to go to cover, a lot of times visible cover. So if you see a lay down there and it's ultra shallow, that's where that fish should be. But we have to, again, focus that in on where are the fish in their seasonal pattern. So it's wintertime, say it's around a creek mouth, or say you were catching fish in a secondary channel. Areas where you were catching fish, that's where you begin to focus. And then you push up shallow, you look for that visible cover, whether it be laydowns, docks, stumps, any of that thing, and you begin to make presentations to that. Now, the thing is that what makes it difficult in the wintertime is you might be doing the right thing, but you're not getting the feedback. In other words, you're not getting the bites. So you can do the right thing all day and maybe only get 2 or 3 bites. So it can be really difficult to clue yourself in. So what I recommend is I go to my confidence stuff. If it's cold, really cold, dirty water, I'm going to pick up a rattling jig in a few different colors, whether it's black and blue, whether it's a dark green pumpkin and black, black and purple, a couple different sizes, and I'll have a couple or three jig rods rigged up where I can begin to flip with different trailers on there, so I can see if I can mimic what those fish want. Again, a few different kinds of spinner baits. For me, a big nighttime spinner bait is a confidence bait for me in cold, dirty water. So I'll have those as well. And between those two baits, I can cover water, and I can really present multiple times to individual pieces of cover. But the main thing I want you to gather from that is don't just go fishing all over the lake. Say, hey, I know there's some good laydowns in the back of this creek, so I'm going to go flip those laydowns. Well, it doesn't matter how cool those laydowns are if the fish aren't there yet. If they're in the first third of the creek and you're in the back third of the creek, nothing good's going to come of it. So focus on where the fish should be, and then begin to present your baits and present your confidence baits into there, and just trust in yourself and just grind it out, because a lot of times you just won't get the bites. You can be doing the right thing all day and just not get the amount of bites that you want. You have to think about strike zones too. In the wintertime, a fish has a smaller strike zone, and then you can combine that with having super dirty water, and that strike zone might just shrink down to nothing, to where you literally have to bump that fish in the face to get them to open their mouth and hit something. Big Bryce said, last Sunday sucked. 5 pounds won with 15 people fishing. Dang, that is pretty bad, dude. All right, any other questions on here? Feel free to ask away. Especially about individual types of change, or say there's a change in condition that I haven't thought of here, like the boat traffic, that you want me to talk about. So just take a peek at that and send me what you got. Hello? Anybody there? Looking for those questions. Nobody wants to ask anything. How much of a temperature change is enough to affect fish movement? To me, and this is when we're talking about surface temperature change, to me that is not as big a factor as a lot of these other things in most cases. When you're talking about seasonal changes, you're talking about seasonal patterns. There's drives that are driving these fish to do different things. A lot of times temperature itself doesn't seem to be as big a factor. It's all relative. So I have noticed, however, that when you do have cold water, a lot of times just finding an area that has a couple degrees difference, so even if it's 2 or 3 degrees warmer, that can make a big difference, whether it's a spring causing that, whether it's a little bit dirtier water that's causing that, maybe it's protected water that's protected from the wind. That would be another condition that I did not put on this list, is wind. On the Tennessee River, we have so much current already that a lot of times wind itself doesn't affect the fishery as much. However, when you have low current times, or if you're on just a lake, a lot of bodies of water that don't have a lot of current, the wind itself is what creates the current. So you really have to follow the wind and fish, wind-blown banks. But you also have to think in your mind, how much wind is too wind? Too much wind, I should say. You can blow out an area by having too much wind. It can create bigger waves and dirty up an area that fish would normally be in. We saw that with some of these, I think it was the FLW tournament down in Florida. They had a lot of areas, talk about on Okeechobee all the time. You'll get wind across the lake, and a lot of other lakes in Florida, like the Kissimmee chain, you get that wind, it'll actually blow out an area that has clean water, because clean water is like the name of the game there. BA Fishing, I'm just starting to fish the lake. It's a learning process to me. Caught an 8-pounder last Saturday for the first time ever fishing the lake. That's awesome, dude. 8-pounder is a dang giant. I haven't been able to catch an 8-pounder in a little while. McGee, awesome question there. What about cloud cover? Again, that's another condition that I didn't put on there. I have to add to this outline. Cloud cover can affect your light penetration. It can cause fish to eat moving baits better throughout the day. It can cause topwater bites to continue on throughout the day, and it can actually kill a bite too if they're relating to something with sun. So say you have a flipping docks, right? A lot of times those fish are keyed into those docks because they can get in the shade. Same thing with certain types of vegetation. If you have matted vegetation, the fish are pulled up under there when it's sunny. Well, if it gets cloudy, a lot of times those fish are free to roam, so they'll pull out and roam around on you, roam out from under the docks, roam out from under the vegetation, and it can be difficult for you to find them. So it's a double-edged sword. You have to be constantly aware of what the cloud cover is doing. And that kind of goes back into the weather and fronts. You have to think about all these things. So if I'm on a good dock flip bite, I might say, well, crud on Saturday when my tournament is, it's supposed to be cloudy. So I need to think a lot of times those fish are going to be pulled out to the outside edges of the dock. They might be roaming closely around the dock. It seems like a lot of times if they're keyed in on that and they're keyed in on eating the bait and little bluegill and things that are under the dock, they'll be close by. But a lot of times they'll be further out, even where your boat is. A lot of times I've marked fish kind of right where I'm sitting instead of underneath the dock, and then I'm known to pull out. How muddy does water have to be before you throw bright baits such as chartreuse colors? Really, for me, anytime water gets stained at all, I don't mind throwing a really brilliant bait. I don't mind something crazy like a mustard color, chartreuse color, pink, any of those colors. As long as that water is kind of in that 2.5 foot or less visibility range, I'll definitely break out those colors and be confident that I can catch fish on them. What about the red color for cold water? Mark asked. Red is an awesome color here for cold water. I tend to do best on red once the water temperatures get 50 to 55 degrees. That seems to be about when most of the crawfish get active again, and that's when red tends to really work. Interesting thing about red too is it's not necessarily and the same thing with chartreuse and other bright baits, it's not necessarily a stained water thing. A lot of times on really clear water fisheries, you can get fish to come unglued and really tag a bait that's a bright color because it'll call fish from a long way away. They're very curious. And they can eat those baits as well, especially if they don't see them every day. Most people don't think to throw a chartreuse crankbait in 20-foot visibility water, but it can work. Melvin says, pros say the second day after a cold front is the worst, in your opinion. My personal best bass that I caught, that 10.42, I caught on the second day after a cold front. So I say that I would agree that it typically makes the fishing a lot tougher. But a lot of times I've just been out there and been stubborn, and I'll grind it out, and I'll get one or two really big bites. I can't tell you how many times I've caught fish over 7 pounds just grinding it out, and I maybe only get 2 or 3 bites, but to me it's worth it to get a chance at a big fish. How does the main river current, this is a good question from Douglas, how does the main river current affect the current in the creeks? It's a good question. It's interesting how that works out. A lot of times I've noticed when the current first pushes on, you'll actually get a backflow into the creeks. And even when they're running a decent amount of current, sometimes it's not actually pulling out of the creek itself, but it'll actually backflow. It'll flow the opposite direction. The same way with secondary channels. So say, I'm going to go right here. Look, okay, here's above Harrison Bay. This is a secondary channel. Come on. There we go. A secondary channel running in here. You could have a lot of current. You watch my cursor there. A lot of current running down the river here, but it can be pushing back up the opposite way in these secondary channels. And the same thing with certain creeks. It can actually push the opposite way. Sometimes you'll have a lot of current coming out of a creek, and sometimes you'll have a little bit of current. So to me, I haven't even been able to really pinpoint exactly when I see different changes. I just noticed that there's all kinds of crazy stuff that does happen in these backwaters when you have a lot of current running down the main river. I think a lot of it has to do with the water itself coming out of the creek or the backwater itself. But that's one of those things I more have to pay attention to it day to day. I haven't really been able to determine a pattern or anything on that. Let's see here. Going to fish Chick Sunday. I'm throwing a trap and a rig. Where do I need to go? I'll be looking around into the main lake flats and into some creeks, and you should be doing pretty good on that. Fish are all over the place right now. There's not really set patterns. I went out, we caught fish today. Big fish we caught was about 6 pounds, and it was in 17 feet of water. And we also caught fish all the way up into just 3-4 feet of water. So this year, and again with these changing conditions, you've had warm weather, so it hasn't forced the fish into a winter pattern. They can spread out. They're comfortable being anywhere on the lake. So there's a lot of different places they're at right now. Some fish are deep, some fish are shallow, but a lot of them tend to be concentrated, kind of getting into that early pre-spawn phase where they're wanting to transition onto the main lake flats, into pockets, and into creeks. Yeah, Jeff says he caught his keepers in sloughs. The same thing. I've noticed that little sloughs and backwater areas have been pretty good for me as well. But it's been interesting. I've noticed it's feast or famine. Some of them have nothing going on. Some of them you're catching fish in. The main key factor to me is I've been looking for sloughs that have crappie rolling around in them and other bait fish, and that tends to be the area where I've been catching fish. Another thing I've been looking for in these little pockets is turtles. We still have turtles coming out, which is really odd for this time of year. Again, warmer weather. But you can look for turtles in cold water conditions, and you'll know that you're in an area with the warmest water around. And that's usually a good place to start. What pound test do I normally use on chick? Over 12. Usually 12-pound test with like jerk baits and sometimes with a lipless. And then beyond that, most of my like jig fishing I do with 20-pound test. A lot of swim bait fishing, 20-pound test. I rarely use 15. Even, most of my shaky heads and stuff like that, I use Magnum shaky heads, heavier duty hooks. So it's hard for me to steer any lower than 17 to 20 in most cases, or straight braid. The only time I really go down below that is if I'm ultra finesse. Like even my spinning rods, the lowest I'll go is 8-pound test anymore. How many fish spawn in the creeks versus main channel flats and cuts? To me, the biggest population of fish is still going to be in these creeks. There's resident fish there, plus there's fish that push from the main lake. So your biggest population is going to be in the creeks, but there is a ton of fish that spawn on the main channel, flats, and cuts as well. Let's see here. Mark says, any tips for this weekend? Again, just like I said before, by this weekend, we're still going to have rain throughout the whole week. So what I'm assuming is going to happen is a lot of current, a lot of higher water. So I would be looking for areas where you have transitions, where you have a mud line. So say darker water with cleaner water coming together. I would look for current breaks related to those areas, and I would be fishing shallow. Again, I like to find stained water versus dirty water if I can, because those fish will still pull offshore, and I can catch them a little bit further out and find areas that other guys are not finding. Jamie says, how is the fishing the big flat, the main river channel coming out of Chester Frost? I'm assuming you're talking about this flat right across here, running down through here. I have not fished that in a month and a half, so I don't know. I'm assuming it's good because there's guys sitting on it all the time. Yeah, Cody says he's been catching fish busting on bait, and that's the same thing with me. Another thing just weird this year, schooling fish all the way January and February. In other words, when I'm saying schooling fish, I'm saying fish actually busting the top. That's why keeping your eyes open. In the cold weather, if you even see one or two fish come up, it's a good idea to go over there because there's not going to be as many that will actually break the surface. So you can go over there and you might catch 50 fish in that one little spot. Whereas in the summertime, I'm not going to go over to an area unless I see them just churning the water. What is the current water temperature? Today, I found anywhere between 47 and right at 50 degrees. It looks like it's going to get more, it's going to be sunny tomorrow and warm again. So I wouldn't doubt it if by the weekend with all this warm rain and stuff that we're got water temperatures, between 50 and mid 50s, something like that. A couple weeks ago, it got up to 60 degrees, which is crazy. Do I have a day job? Mark said, yes. I work for a construction company on Signal Mountain called Sprout Roofing and Construction. Justin says, what colored traps for March? I did a trap video. If you go back and look at that, it's on my channel there. That'll help you out. But for me, March, I'm a guy that has jumped down the rabbit hole when it comes to lipless fishing. So I have tons of money invested into it, a lot of different colors. So I have a lot of variation on different baits and different colors. For me, the big producers in March are chrome colors, translucent colors, and like your red and your chartreuses. So I always like to have a few of those tied on in a few different sizes and sounds, So, but if the water's a little bit dirtier, red, chartreuse. If it's sunny out or if the water's a little bit dirtier, again, I like that chrome. Solid colors like shad patterns if it is a little bit cloudy again, and translucent for when you get into the creeks, because a lot of times the creeks will be clean during March and you need something that looks really natural. Wendy says, do I use a depth finder to find fish in shallow water? That's a really good question. When I get into shallow water, the only thing I care about is what you see in the screen right now, and that's my mapping. If I'm sub 8 to 10 feet of water, to me it's entirely useless to run any of my sonars onto there. And that's because if I'm fishing, let's clarify that. If I'm not fishing, I'll run side scan out. You can only really run it out 30, 40 foot when you're that shallow. But you can look for shell beds and rocks and things like that you can fish. But if you're actually fishing, I recommend cut those sonars off, use your mapping. You're not going to mark fish right below you in like 6, 7, 8 foot of water. On this lake anyway, they're going to scoot away from you. So it's going to be pretty much useless. All you're going to be doing is pinging on those fish. You can hear those sonars ting, 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 ting right on their head. And a lot of times if you pull up on a shallow school of fish and you're right over top of them, or you get too close and you're pinging sonar off of them, it'll shut the school down. What Magnum shaky head do I prefer? Douglas, that's a good question. Go to MGC Custom Tackle. I think it's leaked down in a lot of my videos. They have a Magnum football screw lock shaky head. I've caught tons and tons of huge fish on that bait. And now they're making a smaller version, so in other words, a smaller hook that's still Magnum. I love to throw that, and I'll tell you why. When you have a Magnum hook like that, for one, I can upsize my gear. I can go to bigger line, a bigger rod, a bigger drag system, so I'm more confident when I hook a big fish that I can get them in and out of cover and get them back to the boat. Number two is I don't rip a big hole in the fish's mouth. When you use light wire hooks, especially if you tend to set the hook hard like I do, or you fight a fish relatively hard like I do in a lot of circumstances, what it'll do is it'll tear a long gap in that fish's mouth. And when they come up, if you give them slack or if they shake their head, they're more likely to get off. The heavier duty your hook is, the less flex it has, and the more often it'll just puncture a hole directly through that fish. So it'll puncture a hole and won't rip anything. And you'll notice on a lot of my videos when I'm using that MGC Custom Tackle football head, I'll have to actually grab that fish just like a quality jig and pop that hook out of its mouth, because you can't even get it out with your hand. It's such a clean puncture right through that fish's lip. And I just don't hardly lose fish on that thing. If you watch that, a good video that we did on that was that video, the Big Bass Tour event, where we caught all those fish, those big fish shallow. If you look up that video, that's the head I was throwing for that. Let's see here. Cody says, do I think the structure in shallow areas will be more of a factor in stained water this weekend? They were all over the place in cleaner water. I don't know if you mean by structure is, the lake composition itself. Cover is like the laydowns, the stumps and things like that. To me, if the water is stained, the structure will be important. In other words, the hard spots, the shell beds, that'll be important. If it is really muddy or truly dirty water, in other words, less than a foot of visibility, then at that point, I would say that the cover would be the most important thing to be looking for, the shallow cover. Jim says translucent lipless, noise or silent. I like to have a noisy version and a silent version of a lot of different colors. A lot of times if those fish shut down on a crankbait with sound, you can throw the silent one in there and get that school to continue to fire. Fish Chester Frost. Let's see here. Mark says fish Chester Frost, Salty Creek, tossed rattle trap shallow, never had a bite for miles, backed out, threw rigs in the middle of the channels, caught 10 bass plus crappie and stripe. That's a really good thing. You notice, and that's one thing, just adapting to the conditions. You notice that you weren't catching those fish shallow, so you went ahead and pulled out and started throwing the rig. And that's one thing, just think of that in the back of your mind next time. You might not have to cover miles next time. So say if you find a stretch down through there, you're like, hey, there should be fish here. There's a point here, a point here, a point there. You go fish those highlight key areas. You don't catch those fish, immediately turn around and start doing something else. Don't waste your time, because there's, in the wintertime we have shorter days. So you don't have as much time to break down the lake and catch these fish. So you just can't waste any time. Frankie says, do I put out structure to fish? No. The only thing I've ever done is maybe put out a couple cedar trees here and there. Most of the time, and by structure I'm assuming you mean cover, but most of the time what I'm doing is going fishing what's there, what's existing. I guess probably some of that stuff is what other people have put in the lake. A lot of times too, and I would caution people from setting out cover onto structure spots on the lake. I've noticed, sometimes going out there, there's an area, say there's a ledge that's really good. The fish are on it, catching a lot of fish. Well, I go out there the next time, graph it, and there's a big laydown or brush pile somebody's tried to drop on that thing. A lot of times it can completely change the dynamic of that spot. So instead of those fish sitting up on that ledge and doing what they're supposed to, stacking across it where you can catch them the way you want to, they'll suspend in that treetop that you put on there, or they'll push off to the side of the ledge, or sometimes leave the ledge completely. So sometimes putting cover on an area that's already a good spot can actually inhibit or change the dynamic of that spot. Mark, again, asking about those fish. I think it changes day to day, honestly, as far as those fish moving up and sliding out. The 2 times that you were there, it might have been times when the water was falling just a little bit, and it's amazing to me how far those fish will pull out, even if the water goes down 6-7 inches. Mike says, what boat ramp is good to use? Never fished up there. I would recommend some of the bigger ramps. Put in at Dayton, but be careful running out. Put in at Chester Frost, put in at the dam, areas like that, because for one, you don't have to worry about people messing with your stuff, and for two, they're good, safe ramps. Some of the other ramps, if you're not careful, you can back your boat off the end of the ramp and end up tearing up axles and things like that, or even having to get into the water, because I've had to do that before. Now, when I say shallow depths, what am I targeting? So when I get shallow, there's a lot of things that I target. I mean, when we're talking about offshore fishing, a lot of people think that that's done in deep water. I do a lot of offshore fishing. Say, let's go down here on these flats. Here's a big, expansive flat, right? These flats, any of these little turns, any of these, when you see, this is a good point for you guys. When you see contour lines that are this far apart on a flat, a lot of times that means that you've got a shell bed right there. So those kind of shell beds, those are areas that fish, as they're pushing up into flats, those are stopping points. Most guys would be over here fishing these secondary points down through here and fishing the visible stuff. Well, to me, I would rather be offshore. I'd rather push out to an area that's a little bit harder to find and not necessarily... Oh, what's up, Joe? Man, I saw the baby came home, man. Congratulations, dude. That's awesome. My boy Joe down there is a proud papa right now. So going back to the question, shallow depths, a lot of times it's offshore stuff. Sometimes it's maybe in the back of a pocket. I'm fishing shallow cover. It can be a whole lot of different things for me. It could be vegetation. Justin says, am I fishing the Big Bass Splash? Yes, I plan to fish the Big Bass Splash this year. Is anyone watching the Bassmasters here on Lanier? I didn't even know that was going to happen. Lanier is not a lake that I've really fished a whole lot. I need to get down there. I've got people that I know that live down there. I need to get down there and try to fish that more. See here. yeah, New York, there's not a whole lot going on besides ice fishing, right? Yeah, Joe, you need to get some sleep, dude. Not easy being a papa and getting any sleep. Anybody think of any other, changes in conditions on the lake that we can talk about? Yeah, I did hear Douglas said, yeah, MLF is coming to Chickamauga at some point this year. I don't know exactly when that's going to be. A few more questions if you want to, guys. I'm going to probably take it till about 8 o'clock if y'all are still asking questions. I'm enjoying checking some of this stuff out through here. We can find some place to fish and fish in a tournament Saturday with Mr. Randy. You got to get on the juice. Find some of these fish to catch. Is there a good boat ramp in Saudi Creek? Yes. The Holly Circle ramp is a good ramp. It's a safe ramp that you can put in at. I wouldn't put at the one, I think it's Thrasher Pike. It's a little bit sketchier, and I don't really like the area. I feel like somebody could go in there and break into your truck there. Ooh, Garrett says, favorite treble hooks. Depends on the bait. For a lot of my moving baits, especially if it's something that's going to be that I'm fishing slowly and I feel like the fish is going to inhale, like a lipless bait, and even my spook. I throw an EWG hook a lot on a spook as well, but those EWGs are hard to beat. I like the Gamakatsu EWGs, and I like the Mustad triple grips, the KVD. The short shank ones especially, I like the KVD hooks as well. I fish those on my little small body crankbaits, on a lot of my bigger crankbaits as well. If the fish are slapping, I'll go to a more round bend hook, but the same kind of thing. I like the, as far as round bends, the Owner Stinger hook. It's a 2X hook. That is a really good hook. I use it a lot on my bigger baits as well. If you're chasing out hooks on a jerk bait, and it's something that you need to do often, because with a jerk bait, a lot of times the fish will actually eat that thing and you won't even know that you've gotten a bite. The Gamakatsu, what are they? The Finesse Nano hook, or it's the Aaron Martin's Finesse Nano hook, I think is what it's called. That's a good hook that won't bend on you. When will the grass start to come back? That's usually end of April into May is when I see the biggest push of grass starting back into the lake. It is usually after a lot of the bass spawn. Douglas says, where do I look when the water is rising? I talked about that a little bit earlier, but I look in the immediate area, so in immediate shallower water to where I have been catching fish recently. So in other words, whatever stage the fish are in. We'll go out and give a visual example here. Say this is Chester Frost. Say the fish that you've been catching in Chester Frost, it's further into the pre-spawn. So you're noticing you're catching fish into the middle and final third of the creek. Well, if the water got high and dirty, but I would look for, say you were catching them in this creek bed or on this little point right here. If that water was super high and dirty, I would immediately go shallower around those areas, fish like this dock here, fish some of the stumps that I know are around here. Again, same thing here, they push up into that. Another thing you hear the guys talk about when you're talking about high and dirty water is fishing the original bank line. That usually applies to when you have a flood. So say the water's already high, the water comes up beyond that point. So fishing the original shoreline, you might be catching fish if it floods up in these trees here, but there'll also be a population of fish that'll stay out on the original shoreline out here as well. Let's see here. Joe says, don't storm out all the fish. Well, you got to hurry up and get out here first. What side am I looking at the lake on? This is the Navionics web app. If you just type that in, Navionics up here at the top here. See that? You can go and just zoom in on your local lake. A lot of lakes have good contours on them. Chickamauga is one that has decent contours on Navionics. Other lakes don't have a lot of contours at all, so it depends on your lake whether it's going to help or not. But you can still always look at Google Earth. You know, you can go in here and you can, again, back up into the history and look at different lake levels using that and different conditions and find fish that way as well. Can I catch smallies on the Chick? 2 of the bigger fish that we caught today were smallmouth. Yeah, there's a lot of big smallmouth on Chickamauga. Adam, that's a good question. When you're talking about fishing the upper lake, and so in other words, north of Hiawassee, you're talking about an area of the lake that's much more narrow. Let's go ahead and go up here. See how narrow this is above here? And it fishes much like a river. So in other words, it drops off very substantially right away into the channel. And then you have a lot of shallow backwaters. Well, in the wintertime, when they have the drawdown, you have less water in those backwaters. So there's only a few of them that are as good. And so a lot of times the fish will sit at the mouths of these backwater areas down through here. What I've found is when you have high water on this river system here, it pushes a lot more water into these backwaters, and those fish can really spread out into it, but it's short-lived. So say if that water is coming up, they'll slide up into it, but as soon as it starts to recede, they're getting the heck out of there back towards the river. And it can be really good up there when the water is rising, to answer your question. Wendy says, will change in wind direction affect the fish patterns? For me, in a lot of cases, it's not an immediate change. You know, it takes a minute for the wind to generate enough energy to create a current on the lake. To me, that's really going to change anything. I especially notice there's a change if the wind is predominant from one direction or pretty heavy for 2-3 consecutive days, and that's when I see the wind play more of a role. If you're out fishing and the wind changes, it's not going to immediately affect you in that situation. Garrett says, am I going to fish the Hobie Bass Open? I don't know, man. I'm horrible out of a kayak. I lose so many big fish out of a kayak. I don't know if I'm going to fish or not. Plus $200 entry fee. I don't know about that when I can go to the Big Bass Splash and fish it. So we'll see. Depends on how much money I've got, unless you want to spot me for the entry fee. What's the lowest, Anthony asked, what's the lowest water temperature I would throw a square bill crank? I've thrown square bill cranks all the way down into the low 40s, but I usually throw, once I get past that like upper 40 degree range, I'll throw a flat-sided square bill. 6 cents makes a good flat-sided square bill. And what that does, if you don't know, a flat-sided square bill, a normal square bill is kind of a rounded body, right, and has a really wide kicking action. A flat side, what it'll do is have a more minute kick action to it, and what that does is it's a little bit more finessey for those fish. You know, in the really cold water temps, those bait fish aren't wobbling and kicking all over the place. They have a really tight swim to them, and so it mimics that a little better. Joe said, were we catching them good today? No, we actually had boat problems. We had battery issues. We only got to fish like 2.5, 3 hours, but ended up with a good limit of fish. Had one 6-pounder, another fish that was probably pushing close to 4.5, and filled out the limit with 2s and 3s and stuff. So not horrible. Let's see here. Awesome break now. Thank you, Mark. Thanks, everybody. If y'all think of any videos that you want to see specifically, I'm trying to get out, and if the water will ever let me, I really want to film a good jerkbait video. But the water clarity hasn't really gotten me going on that yet. I haven't been able to field that, but maybe with all this high water, I can do a good jig video, winter jig fishing video for you guys. Let's see here. I know a lot of people have been asking me if I can do some video with, ooh, that barge right there is pretty cool. A lot of guys have been asking me if I can do video kind of combining in some sonar images or some sonar recordings as well, and I've been trying to figure that out. I think I'll be able to get it figured out for the Garmin and be able to do that. So I think that y'all might like that as well. Douglas says swim baits. I don't know about that. I'll probably do a little bit of swim bait videos, but some of the swim baits I've been trying to keep to myself. Let's see here. Jeez, Anthony, 38-degree water temperature. What 3 lures on a cloudy day? Are you talking about with the 38-degree water temperature? When it's 38-degree water temperature, a lot of the bait fish can't handle that very well. So what I'm looking for is if you have Cisco, if you have any kind of herring, shad in your lake, a lot of times that when you get sub 40 degrees, you'll have a lot of those bait will get stunned or get killed off. So a jerkbait bite can be really good. Even on a cloudy day, if it's got a little wind on it, jerkbait can be really good, especially if you pull out kind of a solid color, a more vibrant color, like maybe table rock shad. 38-degree water temperature is blade bait, man. Get the blade bait out, get the fairy wand out, and catch them like that. That's a good way to do it. Another thing, 38-degree water temperature, I'm thinking rig. Rig is a great bait that you can throw all the way down there. Again, I'll go down to those like chicken foot grubs, finesse kind of swim baits on my rig, even though I throw a really big rig in the cold water like that. It's something that you can slow roll down there and get those fish to bite. 38-degree water temperature. What else would I throw? Blade bait. I still throw a lipless, and I work it like a blade bait. It can call fish over, but they have to be in the mood for it. Another thing is, what else have I thrown there that was really good? Ned rig can be good once the water temps get below 40. Something slow on the bottom. And I've done well with the jig. Again, if the water's a little bit stained and it's that cold, a lot of times you're just making multiple flips and you're soaking that jig. I mean, when I say soaking, I'm talking you're flipping into a stump. You're like, hey, there should be a fish there. Flip into there, and you just let it sit and sit and sit. And you might count to 10 seconds and move it a little bit, bang it, to rattle and jig, bang it into that cover. Sit, 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 sit. Pull it out, flip it to the other side of it, sit, sit, and do the same thing over. It can be painfully slow. Let's see here. Oh, New York Giant Stripers, dude. That sounds like a freaking game plan to me. Let's see here. Cody says, have I ever had a bait caster button not want to pop back up when I start a retrieve? The reel just wants to free spin and not popping the button back. I actually have had that happen before. I had an Abu Garcia reel that did that to me. And I had to take apart one of the springs had been, what happened was a bunch of debris. There's a little spring that pops that back into place. And I had to pull that spring out and clean it up of some debris that was stuck in there. What had happened is something had got in there and only about 30% of the spring was working, and that's why it wasn't wanting to pop up. Could also be the gears themselves not wanting to engage that. In other words, there's a mechanism in there if that part has broken. Depending on if it's a nice reel, you might want to send it back and have somebody repair it for you. Garrett says, Saudi custom blade bait. Yes, sir. Let's see here. Man, 43 is still cold for me. Thank you for the support, Brandon. What finesse jigs do I use and A-rig? What company do I go with? Jamie asked that. Look up my A-rig video. I did a complete video. I use hog farmer rigs across the board, but I use different rigs depending on the time of year and conditions I'm faced with. When it gets really cold, though, I like to use that big hog farmer harvester rig. It's as much presence as I can get in the water, and there's so many blades on it that I can keep it, even in shallow water, I can keep that thing going. Keep it horizontal in the water column and fish it ultra slow. I can also put weedless swim bait heads or swim bait hooks on there and actually drag it through brush piles and things. As far as finesse jigs, I use, again, go check out MGC Custom Tackle. I like they have a sniper flipping jig. Let's see, I think that's what it's called. We're going to go over here right now. Y'all need to support these guys. I'm not kidding. These are some of the most amazing jigs. And I'm not sponsored by them, by the way. right here. The shaky heads, ooh, shaky heads right there. Well, here's the flipping jig. This is their Magnum flipping jig. If you look at that hook right there, that's actually a tuna hook that's in this thing. And it does not flex. It does not do anything. Look at that big old fish. And make sure it punctures that hole the right way for the fish. They also have now a finesse jig. I love that thing as well. Again, extremely good hook in there. It's something I can use a little bit beefier tackle with and still get that more compact presentation. The shaky heads I use are right here. I don't use the finesse one. I don't like the straight shake one as much. If you're using a spinning rod, you definitely want to go with that light wire in there. Most of the time I throw a shaky head with a bait caster. So for some of the more compact baits, boom, the mini mag shaky. For all my bigger baits, and this is not a big hook, guys. We're talking like a 4 or 5/0 hook. I'll throw 10, 12-inch worms with that, and I never have any trouble with the fish eating it down or anything. Let's see here. Wow, bunch of questions. I like this. I like it. Yeah, Douglas says I've ever tried hog farmer rig. They're the ones, man. That's the ones I love to use. He uses really, and the reason I use those, I know Scott personally, awesome guy. He uses really high quality components on the rigs, and to me that's the most important thing. I've had other rigs fail before, whether I got hung or stuck a big fish, and that's the worst thing ever that can happen is to have a rig fail on you and watch a big fish swim away because of it. If you were here a week ago, AZ, the water level is about the same now. It's come up and gone down. Anthony says, explain how to fish swing arms. I'm not familiar enough with fishing them. I'm assuming you're probably talking about a channel swing. So say here's an example of a very deep channel swing bank. One that I've caught more fish on. I'll just show you right here around Sequoia. A channel swing, what happens is basically you've got the current is dead ending into a bluff wall. It's dead ending into an area. It can also be offshore. You know, maybe it's a ledge. It's pushing into that spot. So what I look for is irregularities along, especially a bluff wall. The best place on a bluff wall is going to be anywhere where you see a rock slide, where that rock slid into the water and it's pushed out. If you see a little bit there, you can imagine that continues out underneath the water. So what that does is creates a current break. The transitions are good as well. So say you see these contour lines where it transitions here, that can be an excellent place to find fish. So group up on either side of it because you have, again, a current break here, an eddy, and you'll have an eddy downstream as well. Areas like this dock here, you know, that's visible cover along that channel swing. Those are areas that I look for. Again, you're talking about something typically when the current hits something like that, you have a very steep drop. So you have to know how to, you know, if you're fishing a jig down through there, that's one presentation, a shaky head or a jig. I like to fish down those kind of banks. And you have to free spool that. So when you hit, you know, make a cast that's right up against it and then free spool it. So in other words, don't engage your reel and make sure your reel is loose enough to where line can freely flow out of it. That way that bait falls directly adjacent to the bluff without pendulum away from the bluff itself. It'll stay right next to it. It'll drop down. You hit the first little ledge or anything down there and you can slowly pull it off and let it fall. Again, not pendulum, but fall straight down there. And you have to realize, too, a lot of times the fish, it might be 40, 50 foot of water, but those fish, they're only going to sit in maybe they're in 10 foot that day. They're in 12 foot. So once you get a bite and you're confident those fish are only in 12, 15 foot, once that bait sinks past that point, reel it in and make another flip. Don't waste time. Another thing I like to fish is I'll get right up against it and make a cast parallel to that bluff wall with some kind of a moving bait like an Alabama rig, a jerk bait, crankbait. Small body crankbaits can be great for that as well. Let's see here. Fishing Flea says, do I have it handy? Dude, it is in my truck right now. So I don't have it. I tell you what, though, I'll show you right now. Hog Farmer, we're just going to look at products here, I guess. Hog Farmer Bait Company. You can see he's got tons and tons of rigs over here. That picture right there is actually the harvester rig. Let's see here, harvester right here, harvester rig. This is the one. You see you've got 2 individual heads. There's 4 wires on the front, 3 wires on the back. It's a great big long presentation there. Another good one, that one sometimes out of a lot of guys' price range. The 5-wire 8-blade is another good one. Trying to find it. Yeah, 5-wire 8-blade right here. That one is a good one as well. As far as getting a big presentation, a big rig there. But he has a lot of finesse rigs. I use those a lot, like this 3-wire rig in warmer water. But when it's really cold water, I want the biggest rig that I can get a hold of. Let's see, Wilmore says, does Hog Farmer make a 3 armory that I can throw in Alabama rig with only 3 hooks? A 3-arm rig, I guess is what you're trying to say there. Yeah, they make a 3-wire rig. However, what I do is I get the ones with more wires, and I just put my my hooks with, I put a bigger swim bait on the ones with the hooks and use dummies for the other ones. I use the little CPS centering pin. You can see there's a picture of one right there. You can use those little pins to go ahead and screw in your dummy baits. Let's see here. And if y'all would, follow that Tackle Freaks link below, because if y'all purchase any of those rigs through there, that helps me out. Just saying. Cody, I'm not exactly sure which side of the reel you'll have to take apart, buddy. What I would do is look up your reel and see if you can find a diagram of it online. You can usually download a PDF, and it'll show you all reels are a little different on that. Campbell says, with all these really big fish, do I think they're rogue loner fish, or are they hanging out in schools? During the wintertime, definitely. I think those fish are a lot of times separate. They're adjacent to schools of fish. However, I do notice that in this pre-spawn, especially the early pre-spawn, you'll have this few-week period where a lot of the big fish will actually begin to congregate together, and you'll have small packs of really big fish together. In other words, when I say really big fish, I mean fish over 7 pounds that are actually comfortable hanging out with one another. Anthony, on a rig, how do I set the head weights? I'm going to try them. Watch my A-rig video, because I go through there a lot of detail into how I do the individual baits on there. So go back through, watch that video. I think that'll help you out. If you still have questions, go ahead and message me, and I can send you some pictures of my individual rigs if you need to. But it's all about killing that bait out and making sure it's running true. All right, dudes, I'm about to wrap it up. We're at 1 hour and 8 minutes here. If y'all have any other questions, make sure to comment them down below. But I think we're about to call it good for the night. Hope y'all enjoyed. I will catch y'all on the next one. Make sure you comment down below if you've got any individual places or individual live stream ideas that you want me to cover. That'd be great, and we can go on from there. Always looking for new ideas. Fish and Flea says, how can I private message you? Check me out. Hey, check it out. I got money. Super chat. Anybody wants to do that, that's great too. There's that little dollar sign down there in the live chat. You can actually donate money to the channel. That really helps me out. Going back, Fish and Flea, if you want to private message me, I recommend getting on my Facebook page or my Instagram. Both are linked below in the description. Yes, Mark, I try to do this every week. We're going to try to do it every Wednesday at 7 o'clock. I might end up adding another live stream in, but I'm trying to minimize that. A lot of guys don't like the super long videos unless you're actually getting to hang out with me. Okie dokie. I think that's about it. Thank you guys very much. And thanks for all the support. I've been getting a lot of subscribers and stuff lately. I know you guys are sharing the videos and really helping me out trying to get to that 5,000 by the Classic. So all this help is super appreciated. Thanks for hanging out with me tonight, and we'll see what we can do. I am not, Robert, I know you just came into the chat, dude. I'm not fishing the Hobie thing. I don't fish a whole lot of the kayaks. I'm not very good out of a kayak. I've left so many fish out of it. It's ridiculous. Okie dokie. I'll catch y'all next week. Next week, 7 o'clock, Wednesday. We're going to do it again. I don't know what we're going to talk about yet, but it's going to be something awesome. Anthony says, wait. Okay, I'm waiting. What's up? Mark says, do I do guided trips? I'm not licensed to be a guide, so I cannot technically take you on a guided trip. However, definitely check out Billy Wheat. He's an absolute hammer. You know, he fishes all over the lake. I notice he does fish a lot kind of into the northern and middle part of the lake, but he's kind of a really good guide everywhere. Another hammer for the south part of the lake especially is Chris Height. So check those two guys out. Those are the guys that I recommend. Anthony says, can I use your logo on my boat? Heck yeah, man. I don't care. That'd be awesome. Private message me, and I'll see if I can get you the digital thing. I don't know if I'm, technologically adept enough to do that, but I'll try to figure something out. Yeah, this one is actually not mine. This is Bass Attitude Fishing, the hat, and I've got the shirt on as well. But yeah, Chris Sumrell runs that company. Awesome guy. I try to help him out as much as I possibly can. He's the same guy that does the apparel for Mikey Balls and it's Alex Rudd as well. So be sure to check those guys out for sure. Dude, yeah, support the channel. Love it. Yeah, I get the BassQuest one y'all see up here. That's mine. Yep, I've got that, and then I've got, of course, the one that you guys see, I guess, on the thumbnail for the live streams. I've got another logo. My lovely wife got those for me. Yes, Randy, I'm going to get you a hat. You're so picky, though. You don't want these kind of hats. You got to have that old baseball-style hat. I'll get you one. All righty. Here we go. I'm closing out for real now, guys. I'm turning it off. See y'all next time.